Welcome back to Coping with Drought in the Landscape. This is part 2. Alright, mulch. We've talked about this in different modules and we're going to repeat it, so there'll be something to be said for a final exam question on it, I'm sure. Anyhow, let's talk about what kind of mulch to avoid completely. We do not recommend rock or rubber mulch around plants. First of all, it gets very hot and it doesn't break down. Thus, it's not considered Florida friendly. We also don't recommend the use of cypress mulch. Now, some of you may be surprised by this. Why would we recommend against cypress mulch? Well, we are taking cypress trees out of the natural environment and grinding them up specifically to turn them into mulch. This is damaging some of the wetlands in South Florida in the process of obtaining mulch. There are plenty of other alternatives to cypress mulch available at the garden center or even your own backyard. For example, in the lower photograph, oak leaves make a perfectly good mulch. We've talked about the pH of oak leaves being acidic, and if you remember back to the fertilizer modules, I said that really wasn't too much of a problem because most of us already have alkaline soils. So they can be used, pine needles can be used. Melaleuca, the punk tree, we talked about that in the invasive exotic module, and that is being taken out of the wetlands, ground into mulch, and is a good way to recycle this invasive tree. Now, some people worry about using mulch or ground up melaleuca or punk tree as a mulch and fear it's going to start a whole bunch of new trees in their yard. But the mulch is heat processed to kill the seeds, so it's rendered not a problem. So what does mulch do for plants for drought? Obviously, it buffers the soil temperature. It's cooler under the mulch by several degrees. This reduces water loss by evaporation. It also keeps the sun from hitting the soil surface, which prevents weeds from growing. Weeds, of course, would also want water just as much as your desirable plants. So it's really a win-win to mulch around your ornamental plants. Mulch also helps with soil erosion. When raindrops kind of come zooming down from the sky, they hit the mulch and then they spread over a larger area, and thus reducing the force of the water, which would carry soil particles away. Over the course of time, mulch, if it's plant-based, like we recommend, it'll start improving soil structure. This also helps support other microorganisms in the soil, which are generally pretty good for our plants. Mulch, here's a handy little calculator for you. I don't expect you to spit that out on a final exam. That's something you can refer back to, but a lot of times you're wondering how much mulch do you need. So here's a handy little calculator to measure your beds by length by width, and you multiply the area out to determine the number of cubic feet you need, and also make sure you know how many cubic feet each bag is. Typically, most mulch is sold in 2 cubic foot bags, but something like the Melaleuca mulch is sold in a 1.5. Go figure. Mowing. We don't think of mowing and coping with drought going hand in hand or being synonymous, but there is something to be said about this, and we can improve drought tolerance in our turf grass with proper mowing. Here we have two different lawnmower types. The upper picture, the red mower, is your typical uh, rotary mower, and the blades, go round and round, parallel to the blade to the soil surface. The lower right-hand picture, the green mower, is a reel mower. The blades chop it up in a more scissor-like action. Generally speaking, most of us will not have a rotary mower because they're relatively difficult to maintain, but they do a much better job of cutting than a rotary mower. Mow at the proper height to avoid scalping. You can kind of see some lighter areas that kind of look either yellowish or brownish in the photograph on the right, depending on your computer screen and its settings. For mine, they look kind of yellowish. So, most of our Florida lawns are cut much higher than our northern cool season grasses. Our Florida lawns are typically cut between 3 and 4 inches. There are a few exceptions to that, which I'll talk about in a bit. Taller grass shaves the soil better. Think about that. If you get a little extra shade and the sun isn't hitting the soil so intently, it's not drying out as quickly. So it reduces evaporation. A lot of people think mowing shorter is going to help reduce water use in the grass, but it doesn't. Good mowing practices. We'll talk about this also in our turf grass section, so this may be a repeat depending on where you are in the modules. Never remove more than about 1/3 of the leaf blade at any one time. This helps avoid stressing the turf. When plants, turf, anything is stressed, it uses more water. Another thing is keep the blades sharp. A lot of our mowers, especially those rotary mowers, that red one and a couple of slides back, they're designed to mulch or grind up those grass clippings a little extra finely. In the process of doing so, it creates a little bit of a vacuum underneath the lawnmower deck. And it's also sucking up grass clippings and some sand. Now think about it, if you have some nice fine cutlery in your kitchen, if you're a chefy cook kind of person, a foodie. I have some nice German cutlery I bought years ago, and a good knife is a wonderful thing to own, and they will last a lifetime. But they do wear out or get dull. And of course, if you know what I'm talking about, you wouldn't take that good German cutlery out there and run it through the sand a few times and then try to make tissue paper or wafer thin cuts of anything. So the point is, your lawnmower blades wear out quickly in Florida because of the sandy soils being sucked up and ground up by the lawnmower blade. I have seen professional setups, shops that actually change out the blades every morning before they start mowing. That's unusually often, but it's a good thing because when they mow that many properties, they are getting dull by the end of the day. Think about that. So if you don't know how to sharpen the blade yourself, take it to a professional, because the blade has to be balanced. Because if it's out of balance and it's whirling around at whatever RPM, it's going to damage the lawnmower pretty quickly. Notice how a blade, if you see a lot of this torn or ragged, see the arrow there. If you see mostly that on your grass blades, it's telling you you have a very dull blade. Also, you're effectively cutting it shorter. See how it's ripped down by maybe about a half an inch or so into that leaf blade? That's like cutting your fingernails right down to the where it starts growing. Very, very hard on the plant. Also, the plant will use extra water to seal those areas. And as we have learned in the past, that plants do not heal, they only conceal. Again, this is kind of a repeat, but cutting at the higher end reduces the turf's need for water and fertilizer, as well as encourages a deeper root system. Now think about that for a minute. A deeper root system means a deeper or bigger area to absorb the water and nutrients. So therefore, when we mow tall or high end of the recommended side, we can reduce the need for fertilizer a bit. It helps reduce thatch accumulation. Thatch is not the leaf blades or the grass clippings, but it's the stolons or runners that they're attached to. Better pest tolerance. When the grass isn't stressed, usually there are fewer pest issues. Now think of some of the pests. We're not just talking insects, there are also diseases out there. Better survival from other environmental stresses like drought and also cold. And yes, we do get cold, as we've discovered by a few winters ago. I don't expect you to remember every last minutia on this slide for a test or quiz question, but you should understand that most of our warm season grasses are mowed between 3 and 4 inches. When in doubt, that's pretty much a good rule of thumb to fall back on. Let's look at Bahia. Here it says 3 to 4 inches. It falls within that typical rule of thumb. It needs to be mowed about every 7 to 10 days during the growing season for sure. In the winter, that'll stretch out to maybe once every couple of weeks, or maybe not at all if we've had a hard frost or freeze. Now, Bermuda grass, you see, doesn't fall under the 3 to 4 inch rule of thumb. Most of us are not growing Bermuda grass purposefully, but it's a weed in our St. Augustine or Bahia or other turf that we're growing. But there are a few instances where people do either plant common Bermuda, or if they were sold some of the golf course type Bermudas, good luck to them. Those are high maintenance Bermuda grasses. Not all Bermuda are created equally, but Bermuda can, because it has a finer leaf blade, you know what I'm talking about. It's got a very, very fine leaf blade. It can be mowed shorter. Bermuda grows very fast and aggressively, so it needs frequent mowing to look good. In the summer months, and like golf courses, they're doing it every day or every other day to keep it that nice short carpet. Centipede, we don't see too much centipede coming into the extension offices. Typically, I see this only around old homesteads in the Dade City, Zephyr Hills area, and a few other places here and there. I generally do not see it in any developments that have been put in the last 40 or so years. So centipede, also finer leaf blade, grows a little slower. As you can see, it can be mowed a little less often than some of our other warm season grasses. And, it has a relatively short mow, but 2 inches is probably where I would recommend for most homeowners. Now, St. Augustine is probably the most common long grass, followed by Bahia. And you can see 2.5 to 4 inches. Well, I just said a few moments ago 3 to 4 is kind of a good rule of thumb to live by. There are some dwarf St. Augustine grasses, as we've talked about in the turf grass modules, or if you haven't gotten to that, when you get to the turf grass modules. The point is, there are some dwarf St. Augustines that can tolerate a little shorter mowing. They have a finer leaf blade, they don't grow as tall naturally, and can do well at about 2.5. Generally, I recommend those even be mowed at 3. Again, the interval I don't expect you to remember, but the dwarf sometimes can go as long as 2 weeks. So some people like the dwarf St. Augustine for that reason, but it has some other issues we'll talk about in other modules. Zoysia. Now, there's zoysia, there's hybrids of zoysias, there are cultivars of zoysias, there are species of zoysias. So zoysia covers a lot of different types of zoysia grasses and cultivars and species. Generally speaking, the one that's most common is Empire zoysia. That one has dominated the market in Florida for about the last 15 years or so. In general, zoysia grass, because it has a finer leaf blade, is mowed relatively short, even in Florida, between 1 and 2 inches. I don't have it here, but you might want to write some notes off to the side, boys and girls. It's a hint. Empire zoysia seems to be better when it's maintained at about 2.5 to just under 3 inches, somewhere in that frame. It hasn't been hashed out exactly by the university, but from what I hear, when we have problems, I find people are mowing it at usually 2 inches or less, and I usually recommend they move it up to 2.5 or just under 3, and they usually seem to have much better luck with Empire zoysia mowed a little bit taller than what you see here under optimal height. Hint, hint. All right, other things we can do during drought if you don't already have micro irrigation. Micro irrigation, obviously, micro means small irrigation. The point is, it puts out a small amount of water in a very small area. Usually, these micro sprinklers or sprays shoot out water about 3 to 6 feet across. I much prefer that over drip in our sandy soils because there's better wetting. And as we've talked about, or you will learn, depending on where you are in the modules, about micro irrigation, they are very efficient at watering when used properly. Typically speaking, this irrigation puts out about 2 inches of precipitation rate per hour. So it has to be used very carefully. A lot of people think these need to run for many hours and overwater even though it's a micro irrigation system. But these are great for areas that are good for do-it-yourselfer. Also, these are exempt from water restrictions. At least currently they are. This is great for vegetable gardens and things that do need more frequent water, or if you have a bed of annuals that would need to be watered more than once a week. So during drought or not, micro irrigation makes a lot of sense for our landscapes. All right, a lot of people don't know when plants need to be watered. Well, remember back to our botany modules, our patient Lucy's, impatiens. You like the scientific name, you people, you out there in Cyberland. Okay, so our impatiens, what do they look like when they need water? They're kind of all droopy and kind of bent down, and the leaves are all kind of wilty and curled up, and the plant just is because there's no pressure, water pressure against the cell wall to keep it turgid or rigid. Well, here's turf grass. This is a St. Augustine cultivar of some sort, maybe Floratam, I can't tell. But it does not need to be watered. You can see the leaf blades are fully expanded open as far as a monocoque can do, or this particular monocoque can do. So it's fully turgid or rigid or hydrated. Now notice the color. St. Augustine's, most of the cultivars have this blue-green color. We've selected for that shade of green or blue-green. We like that to the human eye. Now notice the coloration and notice the color change when I switch the slide in a second. See how it goes to a duller kind of grayish green, or just a duller grayer, not as vibrant a green. It's just, yeah, by comparison. Also notice what the leaf blades are doing. They're rolling up lengthwise. Notice I said they're rolling up lengthwise. They don't bend over like our impatiens do, but they roll up lengthwise like a cigar. And that is a water conservation technique that grasses employ. You'll even see this in corn in fields that are drought stressed if you drive further north where we grow a lot of corn in this country. So this is telling you you're going to have to water the lawn your next irrigation cycle. But a lot of people think we're stressing the lawn if we go and do this. Well, a little bit of stress is okay, but not too much. What we're also telling the plant is, put down deeper roots at the same time. So it can actually work very much to our benefit to start to wean lawns off of regular irrigation. So how much and how often? Always a big question here. Efficient watering wets only the root zone and doesn't allow the water to run off. Typically, the root zone of most of our plants, as we have learned in other modules, is between about 1 to 2 feet, with trees and some shrubs going a little deeper than that 2 feet. But by and large, the vast majority of roots of our plants are in the upper foot or so of soil. This is especially true of turf grasses, where, depending on the turf grass, like if it's St. Augustine, much of their root mass is in the upper 6 inches or so, whereas Bahia may be about a foot or more down. Now, what a lot of people goof up is when they water is they change they what they do is they turn back the amount of water that they apply in the winter and keep the interval the same once a week. But what you really want to do is extend the intervals, the days in between water events or irrigation cycles in the winter or summer. Think about it. If the days are very long and very hot and very dry, ideally you want to water more often. Now we have restrictions that allow up to once a week for, non-reclaimed water. Let's say it that way. The point is, in the winter months when the days are cool and short, we can go maybe 2 weeks or 3 weeks in between irrigation events, but we still want to wet up the root zone when we do irrigate. So that is usually something people misunderstand. And of course, a lot of people have a set it and forget it kind of mentality when it comes to irrigation. Ideally, we should use it as needed. If it's summertime and you got rain last night, your system doesn't need to go on again. But a lot of people just get reliant on the time clock and think that little rain sensor was going to last forever and bypass a irrigation event. They don't. They don't always keep on working forever. They do fail, as we have learned in irrigation. We can condition landscapes to do well on less water, and maybe we should encourage this more than we do. Water plants only when they start to wilt. That is telling the plants send out deeper roots. It also is doing other things physiologically in the cell that helps them adapt to a little extra dryness. Again, apply a known amount of water, 3/4 of an inch. This wets up typically that upper foot of soil, whether it's sand or clay. A lot of people don't have any idea how much your irrigation system is putting out. A lot of times I'll ask them, how much are you watering? And they'll say 20 minutes. Well, 20 minutes, how much is that? It's 20 minutes. I don't know how much that is. I just know it's running for 20. That is not a very good way to irrigate, but this is how most people do it. They just set their system up for a number of minutes to run the zone, or worse yet, it's the settings that the builder put on to establish turf grass, and it's been going like that for days, weeks, months, years in some cases. If we're conditioning plants to survive for drought conditions, we want to do it ahead of drought. Makes sense, because this process can take about 6 weeks. Irrigating correctly. This is something all master gardeners should be able to say in their sleep. This is a big hint to you as a trainee. So, you should know these steps in calibrating an irrigation system. Now, I use the word calibrate and people start weirding out and the eyes usually glaze over when we're in an in-person class. I can't quite see what you're doing because your camera's at the wrong angle on your laptop right now. So, oh, I saw that. You are getting glazed over up there. Okay, so calibration isn't as difficult as it sounds. If you can get some tuna fish cans or straight-sided cans and a ruler and go outside and turn on a time clock, then you pretty much got most of the steps down of what you need to do. First of all, you want to put out several small straight-sided cans randomly in a zone. Let's say this particular picture, that is zone 1. It could be your front yard. It could be your backyard. They're sometimes wired differently than zone 1 being the front yard. So you want the system to run for a known amount of time. Usually I say 10 or 15 minutes. So let's say I run it for 15 minutes and then I turn off zone 1. Then I go and measure the amount of water in each can. You want to try to get an average of 3/4 of an inch in each of those cans. Now there are times when you don't always get that. That could be due to broken heads. It could be due to mismatch heads and many other factors as we've talked about in irrigation, or we'll talk about in an irrigation module if you're not quite there yet. Either way, 3/4 of an inch is what you want for that. So this kind of zone which has a rotor may need to run for an hour, for example. Then you go to zone 2 and repeat the process. This is where most master gardener trainees fail to answer the question correctly. You just don't stop with zone 1. You want to do it for all your zones. That's a big hint there. I see those glazed over eyes. You moved the camera, didn't you? All right, the point I'm trying to make is you go to zone 2. So zone 2 may have more closely spaced heads. It may have different head design altogether. And you may find that that zone needs to only run for 20 minutes. You may find that other zones need to run longer or shorter than the times I'm giving out. But once you know that each zone to get 3/4 of an inch takes a certain amount of time, you can write that down on a slip of paper, keep it in your time clock box, and the only time you would change the amount of run time on there is if you were to swap out some components of the irrigation system, like new heads where you had to put in a different pipe or something like that. So here are the steps again. He's repeating it and saying it several times. That usually means it's on a quiz. You want to place some small-sided, small straight-sided cans, tuna fish cans, pet food cans, something like that, randomly in a zone. Allow the system to run for a known amount of time, then measure. You want 3/4 of an inch on average. Now, some cans, like I said, may be a little over or a little under, and some may have nothing in it, which means you have a problem probably that you'll need to correct. But that's not part of the calibration process per se. Then you want to repeat that for each zone. All right, I like putting things into perspective of life. Watering a half an acre of yard only once a week. Now, a lot of you don't have an acre, or half acre. Most of you have probably a quarter acre or less. But let's say half an acre, only once a week. I hear I can only water once a week. Well, that's going to equal about 40,000, almost 41,000 gallons of water a month to water a half an acre to 3/4 of an inch. If you extrapolate that out for a year, that's just under 500,000 gallons of water per year. If you have a pool, how many pool loads of water is that? That's an awful lot of water, isn't it? 40% of our drinking water goes to watering the grass on average. Now, during drought periods, this sometimes soars up to, it's estimated to maybe even 70% or higher, depending on the severity of the drought. But on average, 40% of what we clean up, process to become drinking water goes to watering turf grass. What's really sad about that, only 1% of the drinking water produced is actually consumed. So what do I mean by that? The stuff that you take out of the tap and drink or cook with or actually somehow consume it. I'm not talking about what goes down the toilet. I'm not talking about what goes in the washing machine or dishwasher or down the shower drain. This is us actually drinking it. So we go to a great expense and great lengths to make it very, very clean, and only 1% of it gets drunk. Now, how much water do you think for a lifetime, assuming an average lifespan of 80 years, how many gallons of water do you think you will consume or drink in your lifetime? Let's think about it. 5,000? 10,000? 20,000? 30,000? 100,000? 200,000? Not talking about for bathing or cooking or washing dishes, what you will consume to survive. It's kind of a hard question. Probably something you never really thought about. But I have. To provide a lifetime of drinking water for one human is about 16,000 gallons of water. I bet you thought it was higher. Alright, some final tips for more efficient watering. Learn to recognize when plants need water. Now this plant here on the right looks like maybe an azalea, but some plants, tomatoes, impatiens, etc., they'll wilt during the heat of the day. You know, when it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon and even if the sun isn't on, some of those plants, they just heat. It's called heat wilt. We do the same thing when it's that hot out there. It's like, They just cannot replace the water uh, from the roots and get it up into the stems fast enough for what's being lost through the leaves. Now, if these plants are withered by evening, then maybe they need water. Ideally, I hold off till the next morning. Also ensures that if in the morning they're still wilted, I know for a fact that they are in desperate need of a good drink of water. Try to minimize plant stress. You know, over-fertilization is a stress. Heavy-duty pruning is a stress. whacking them back, doing weird things around them. All that can stress them out. Fertilize appropriately. A lot of times during drought, what a lot of the plants start to take kind of a peaked look or an off color, and what do people do? They start throwing fertilizer on it. And fertilizer, when you give a lot of nutrients, all of a sudden tells the plant grow. When you're trying to tell it, no, survive, just, chill out a little bit. Other things that you might want to do, especially if your irrigation system is a little wonky, and trust me, there are wonky irrigation systems out there. It's pretty much more universal than it is an oddball. A lot of people, we covered turf, and there's nothing wrong with turf as we've discovered in our Florida Friendly Landscape module to have that, but sometimes it may not be practical or easy to maintain for various reasons. It's just too hot and dry, the sprinkler system doesn't irrigate very uniformly out there, or what. So maybe this is the time to reduce those turf grass areas. And you can see all those pictures have done different ways of doing it. The upper left hand, you can see that they extended out the typical shrub bed around the base of the house. They moved it out toward the yard more, and they put the curbing around. Not a fan of that personally, but if that floats your boat, I'm not going to change your world, okay? I like the one in the upper right hand side because they brought some of the flower bed right to the sidewalk. Now that may not fly in every HOA that there's one blade of a leaf or of a plant overhanging onto the sidewalk. So I do understand those HOAs and those covenants, deeds, and restrictions. Remember, you signed on for that, though. The point is, we see this style more in Europe, where people bring the garden out toward the street, and in America we hold it right up against our houses like we can't, let it go or something weird. The lower picture in the middle has some turf. You can see where the stake is, holding up the little, I guess that's a holly tree. And there's some turf down there, but you can see the ground cover with the yellow flowers. That's perennial peanut. That can survive on natural rainfall. And the two have been used very, very nicely. Also notice their style of pruning of the shrubs. It's a more informal or natural form for these particular plants. I'm not quite sure what they are, but maybe Simpson stopper is a guess. But the point is they didn't turn them into a box, a meatball, or a pyramid. Those will maintain themselves a lot better and not need a lot of heavy duty pruning. So some things to think about. Our final tips, hydrozones. I contend that most of our landscapes are cactus and impatiens, and unfortunately, we water them all the same. We don't group plants according to their water needs, or hydrozones. It's okay to have high water use plants grouped together and watered appropriately. And there's nothing against the Florida friendly rules to say you can't have some annuals or other high water using plants. But again, then water it when you got something that doesn't need much. Most of our trees and shrubs, something's going to give. Experiment with gradual reductions in irrigation. As I mentioned, condition the yards to do better on less. In some cases, depending on where you live, you can use mulch pathways. Here it's intercepting the water and it's going to get directed into these particular plant beds. Now that isn't a look everyone likes, and it's not always going to fly by the HOA covenant deed and restrictions, so make sure to get your architectural review committees on board if you decide to do something like this. Alright, just kind of a wrap up of this module. Always keep about a 3 or a 4-inch layer of mulch around your plants. Make sure to keep the mulch away from the stems so you won't have any rotting of the plant tissue. After about 3 inches, there's really not much additional benefit, just costs more. Minimize pruning, especially during drought. Add organic matter to the beds before planting. Depending on where you are in the series, we may have talked about this, but amending individual holes for plants generally does not provide a long-term benefit. It is good to do it for a large area like a big plant bed way ahead of time. Probably the best way to add organic matter is through mulch that is plant-based to begin with and let it break down and kind of, quote, compost in place, unquote. calibrate your irrigation system. We know how to do that. We know the steps. And you know to repeat it for all the zones. Okay, I've warned you. You might want to have your sprinkler system tuned up yearly by a professional or somebody, or even yourself, cleaning heads, checking heads, seeing if grass has grown over them, things like that. Water thoroughly but infrequently, encouraging deep root system. Now I've talked about avoiding fertilizer during drought, but there is kind of an elephant in the room. Well, not literally. Well, maybe not in my room where I am, but maybe where you are there is. I don't know. Anyhow, the point I'm trying to make is potassium. You may have read about potassium fertilization and helping during times of drought and also cold stress. Okay, let's try to back up a second. What nutrient encourages most of the leaf growth? Think about this. We have the three big ones on the front of the bag. Then we have the secondary macros. Then we have the micros. So the first three are N, P, and K. They're the primary macronutrients. Then we have secondary, and then we have the micros. Well, nitrogen is the one that promotes most of the leafy growth. So during drought, we especially want to avoid nitrogen fertilization. There is a little bit, but not really great research on this, but potassium, if given to plants at the right time, may help a little bit with drought. It also helps a little bit with cold tolerance from frost and freeze, but it has to be delivered at the right time in the right amount. Unfortunately, when I said there's a little bit of research, there isn't a really good dipstick to say it makes it this much more drought tolerant or it makes it that more cold tolerant. So it's one of those, I think less is more, and when in doubt, don't. So I generally do not recommend potassium fertilization during drought, or for that matter, for cold tolerance. All right, that ends coping with drought in the landscape. Yay, you made it through another module. All right, I'll be back with other modules